Although I'd been raised by God-fearing parents, I'd fallen away in my 20s and worshipped nature rather than our Creator. To my mind, a loving God would not allow the miseries of the world to persist and grow. I was a lost soul. I desperately wanted to know the Lord, but His voice was elusive to me. I knew it broke my father's heart to see me turn my back on the Lord, and he did everything in his power to show me the error of my ways. Being his daughter, I shared his stubborn side, and the more he tried to pull me in, the harder I resisted. You need to understand that my father had a variety of health issues, many of which had sent him to the hospital several times. My sister and I worried about his health and tried to do our best to look after him. He had suffered several heart attacks, had COPD, diabetes, and Parkinson's disease. The very fact that he was still alive should have been a clue to God's grace, but I was blind. I chalked it up to his stubbornness and refusal to die. A group from his church set out for Spain on a tour of religious sites. He loved to travel and experience new cultures. In spite of his health issues, he eagerly signed up to go. He promised to stick to his prescribed diet of limited sodium, but the temptation of the Spanish olives had proved too great for him. Tossing caution to the wind, my dad enjoyed the rich cuisine, eating to his heart's content. His fellow travelers were unaware of his dietary restrictions and unwittingly encouraged him to indulge. As you might expect, he began to retain water, putting a tremendous strain on his ailing heart. He had needed to be hospitalized on a previous trip overseas and was in no mood to experience that again. He opted instead to grab an early flight home. If he was going to require hospitalization, he planned to do it at home, with his own doctors attending. He boarded the flight and was on his way home. When he felt a stabbing pain in his chest, he knew he was in trouble. The flight attendant informed the cockpit, and the jumbo jet performed an emergency landing in Reykjavik, Iceland. It was the closest landing strip that could accommodate the big plane. He was rushed to the hospital in full heart failure. His situation was grim, and he was placed in the intensive care unit until we could make travel arrangements to be with him should the worst happen. The cost of tickets was astronomical, so we decided to send my sister as our representative. I had a young child and a demanding job, making it impossible for me to go along. I know those days were hard for her, sitting at his bedside day and night. I felt so hopeless and helpless that it was driving me crazy. I was snapping at people and constantly on the verge of tears. I had a very special relationship with my father, and his loss would be devastating to me. I felt as though I was grieving already, though life support was keeping my dad alive. The Icelandic doctors conferred with his regular doctors, as his multiple health issues presented different challenges. The medication to reduce the amount of water he retained caused kidney failure. The meds for the kidneys affected his heart rate. It was a vicious cycle, all of which was taking a toll on his worn-out body. Days turned into weeks, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that I would never see my father alive again. Our entire family and many friends were praying for my dad, day in and day out. I wanted to pray, but I was a pagan, sitting on a fence. If there was a God, he was cruel to be taking my father this way, with no closure, no goodbyes. We established a telephone tree to get information out easily and efficiently to our rather large family. With every phone call, I was encouraged to keep my dad in prayer, as they were doing. Most of them were not aware of my pagan status at the time. I would give them lip service, but did not follow through. After a full month had passed, the doctors came to the difficult conclusion that my father was only kept alive through life support. My sister and I had an awful decision to make. The medical bills were piling up, and my dad was suffering so much chaos in his body that it broke our hearts. Still, having to say the words, "pull the plug," was more difficult than anything either of us had had to do in our lifetimes. When I hung up the phone after making the choice with my sister, I cried. I cried long and hard, to the point where I was physically exhausted. In desperation, I called out to the God of my father and chastised him severely for taking this godly man away from me. I literally shouted out to him, asking, "Why?" I ranted and raved like an idiot until I had nothing left within me. Luckily for me, our Lord is a merciful God, and even in my full assault, He touched my heart. My body and mind were exhausted, but my spirit gained the strength I needed to humble myself before Him and beg for forgiveness. I prayed, "Oh God, I want to believe in you. I do believe that Jesus was your Son, and He came to save us poor sinners. I know I don't deserve anything from you. I have turned my back on you for too long. But, Lord, my dad never turned his back on you. He loves you with all his heart and soul. Please don't take him this way. I need him in my life." I knew there was no way my dad was going to revive. I could hardly expect God to answer my prayer. I had not only turned my back on God, but I'd spoken irreverently of Him on many occasions. I had lived my life for pleasure, with no consideration of the consequences. I was the worst sinner ever. In my heart, I wanted to believe I was a good person. I was kind and accepting of others. I donated to charity and worked with the homeless. I was earning favor with my actions, but not backing it up with my heart. As I reflected on my life, I began to see how hurtful my life had been to the Lord. The sadness I felt simply added to my grief. In fact, if I had not had a small child at home, I might have retreated completely from my life. My beautiful daughter kept me going, and my love for her swelled. I could see that she was a gift from God, and I was grateful. I was still angry, but grateful nonetheless. It was amazing that I could feel anything at this point. I should have been numb, but instead, my heart was moved, and there was no denying it. I spoke to my sister once again by phone. The time difference had left her tired and drained, as well as the emotional roller coaster she had been on the past 30 days. I wished I could be with her, to help support her in any way I could. Instead, I was helpless, thousands of miles away. She was in a harsh hospital with bright lights and shiny metal instruments, machines making a bleeping noise at regular intervals. She did not speak the language, and although the doctor spoke English, she had doubts about the translations, adding to her insecurity and fears. We both wept openly. I remember telling her, "It will be okay. Dad would not want to live this way. You know that. He knows we love him, that you love him. You are only doing what is right. I know this is unbearably hard, but try to remember. He would want this." As I was speaking, I felt a shift deep inside me. It was a little unsettling, but then again, not. I'd set out to help ease my sister's burden, since she was the one present and who was dealing directly with the hospital, but as I spoke, I began to believe the words myself. I could almost feel my father reaching out to me, telling me to let go. He wanted me to trust God as He did. I felt a peaceful reassurance settling deep in my soul. I thought about my dad's life. He had done amazing things, known many famous people, traveled the globe, and always kept God and Jesus in the forefront of his mind. I'd never really thought of my dad as a man before. He was simply Dad. I remembered hearing stories of his youth, his war experience, his travels and family, but somehow I had never fully considered him as a human being. My dad was easy to like and very giving. He was always running errands or giving rides to people who had no car. He regularly worked with the guide dogs for the blind, providing rides to and from church service when the recipients were going through their 7-week training period with their dogs. He had integrity. He was quick with a joke or a smile, but firm and unrelenting when it was necessary. I realized how intelligent my dad was. He had always seemed a little goofy to me, but really, he had been able to read people with ease and offer the support they needed. A gift won him the friendship of many. I admired him more than I ever had before, and I wished I had paid better attention while he was with me. I was sad, but not as sad as I had been in the previous weeks. There was a sense of peace deep inside me. I felt my dad was reaching out to me to say goodbye for now. I had an overwhelming feeling I would see him again. I had to laugh at myself. Was I actually envisioning going to heaven? Only a month ago this would have been absurd to me, but now, not so much. I silently thanked the Lord for the peace of mind heaven offered. I wasn't 100% sold, but I was entertaining the idea of a God who offered eternal life for those who believed in His Son, Jesus. That peaceful feeling in my heart should have been evidence enough, but, being stubborn as I was, I needed more convincing. I never asked her, but I believe she felt that shift in me too. Something subtle in her voice told me so. I think she may have experienced a similar feeling, but I did not want to open a can of worms by asking. We spoke with the doctors on a conference call and determined a course of action. All life support systems would be shut down at 6 p.m. Iceland time. That was 10 a.m. my time. We passed the word among the family, and more prayer chains were set up to coincide with the procedure. I opted to be on my own, at home. I tried to busy myself and keep my mind off the inevitable, but I could not keep my eyes off the clock. It moved so slowly. My daughter was in daycare, too young to understand what was happening. I had done my best to keep her world steady and secure. There would be time to explain to her later. I needed something to keep my mind occupied, but it was hard to concentrate on much of anything. All I could do was replay my dad's life in my head over and over again. I found the process oddly comforting. I laughed to myself when I recall a nickname he had earned many years ago. As I've mentioned, my dad had a lot of medical issues. He had survived 3 forms of cancer, including colon cancer, when his doctors gave him 6 months to live. His colon had actually ruptured, spilling toxic poisons into his abdominal cavity. A long and difficult surgery ensued, and the doctors were able to repair the damage, but he would be left with a colostomy bag. For a proud man like my father, that was a hard blow. Nevertheless, Dad pressed on against the odds. Eventually, the doctors were able to remove the colostomy bag and repair his colon completely. That was 8 years earlier. Twice he had suffered heart attacks that should have killed him, by the doctor's statistics, but he pulled through both times. My sister and I had begun to call him Lazarus, because he had an uncanny way of beating death. Dad always attributed it to God. He would say, "Guess my work here is not finished yet." I have to admit that there was a tiny voice inside me hoping for the same outcome this time. But I knew better. My dad had lived a long, good life. He deserved to rest now. I gave in to God's will and accepted it was time for Dad to go home. I checked the clock once again, and it was 9:45 a.m. The phone rang, startling me. I didn't want to answer it, in case I would get caught up in an idle conversation. This was a sacred time for me. I did not want to be disturbed. I felt a little tug at my heart to pick up the receiver against my better judgment. It was my sister in Iceland. She wanted to speak with me one last time before it happened. Both of us were strangely at peace. Maybe we had grieved sufficiently during the past 30 days. The sound of each other's voice helped soothe us, and we hung up just before the doctors were going to disconnect everything. My sister was with him as the machine slowed down, finally coming to a halt. The room was silent, and the staff was good to let my sister have a moment to say farewell. She leaned over him, sobbing on his chest, and petted his hair tenderly. She felt him flinch and jumped back, startled. The doctor gently explained that his reflexes were still receiving signals, but that would soon be over. The staff began to move around again, moving machines and clearing the area while my sister held our father in her arms. There was a flurry of activity around her, so she must have been hearing things when she thought she heard my father moan. She quickly dismissed the noise, thinking that his body was simply reacting to the transference of life. A nurse walked over to remove the tube that had been shoved down my dad's throat to help him breathe. My sister stepped back to give her room to work. Skillfully, she extracted the intubator swiftly in one sweeping motion. Not that he could feel it, but it was a customary way to give the patient the least amount of discomfort. Had he been alive, the procedure would have been very unpleasant, and the nurse would have restrained him to avoid injury. That was not necessary this time, so she leaned in, firmly grasped the tube, and pulled. Suddenly, my dad's arm flew up in the air as he pushed the nurse away in terror. She screamed, and my sister screamed too. Could this be another reflex action, she wondered? But before she could ask, the staff were back in action. The doctor ran back to his bedside and checked him out. He was breathing on his own, but shallowly. The doctor was as surprised as anyone could be to see the heroic struggle my father was going through. He clung to life by his fingertips, but the doctor wished he would simply let go. He knew this was tearing my sister up to witness, and his compassionate heart went out to her. He tried to usher her out of the room, but she could not leave him. The doctor told her that some people have a hard time letting go, and it would be easier for our dad if she left the room. Hesitantly, she turned to go, but she looked on our father one last time. As she turned to walk out the door, a low growling voice asked for a glass of water. The voice was weak and gravelly from the intubator, but it was undeniably the voice of my father. His eyes fluttered open and focused on his daughter. He tried to smile, but was in a lot of pain. Every nurse and doctor in the room was astounded. They moved quickly to provide him some relief from his pain, and they were happy to supply a sip of water as he had requested. Laughter and applause filled the room, and the staff patted each other on the back in congratulations. "This is a miracle," the doctor declared, and several of the staff members gave thanks to God. "There is no way he can still be alive. He was brain dead." They shook their heads in disbelief, but full of self-satisfaction for a job well done. My sister ran to his side, saying, "Thank God! Daddy, are you okay?" Our dad struggled to say anything more. His throat was raw and dry from weeks of intubation. His insides were broken and bruised from the barrage of treatments that had been employed in his weeks of care. His eyes were red and weary, but the hint of a smile was there on his lips. My sister could hardly bear to leave his side, but she knew I needed to be told that Dad was still alive. When the phone rang at 10:45 a.m., I knew it was my sister on the other end. I answered the phone solemnly, unsure of what to say. My sister was carrying on so that I could not tell if she was laughing, crying, or both. She was hysterical in any case. I tried to calm her, to offer words of wisdom and support, but she would not have it. She was babbling incoherently on the other end, and I was certain the stress had caused her to go Fruit Loops. I could hear the ongoing commotion in the background, but I attributed that to the general hospital noise. I could make out her words, but they did not make sense. For a moment, I wondered if she would be competent to arrange for the trip home with his casket. "Don't you understand me?" she asked incredulously. "He is alive. They took him off the life support and he woke up. It's a miracle." She was laughing. She was downright giddy with glee. I could hardly believe my ears. My dad had fought his way through many ordeals, but this seemed impossible. My sister held out the phone to the doctor and asked him to explain it to me. "I'm sorry, doctor. My sister has obviously cracked under the pressure of the past month. What can I do?" I asked. "I know it seems impossible, but your dad has woken up. He actually spoke to us asking for water. I would not have believed it if I had not seen it with my own eyes. This is a medical miracle. There are still concerns, of course, but he seems to be functioning independently of his machines," he said. I was dumbfounded. It was true. My sister was not crazy. There was new hope. I could hardly wait to call the family with the good news. As I hung up with my sister, I thanked God, deeply and earnestly. I suddenly realized God had heard and answered my prayers, and those of our loved ones. There was no other explanation. He was still not out of danger, but if the Lord had brought him this far, there was no doubt in my mind he would come home again. I continued to pray and praise God for the next several days, as the doctors on both sides of the pond conferred and came up with a plan to medevac Dad home to the States. It was incredible how fast he was bouncing back. He was able to take food again and was up and walking short distances. His throat was still sore, but that did not keep him from flirting with the nurses and telling the doctors all his old jokes. His doctors from home conferred with me to plan his arrival and transportation to his local hospital, where they would take over his ongoing care. "I've known your dad a long time," his doctor told me one day. "I've seen his faith pull him through dire times, but nothing like this." I spoke daily with Reykjavik. There was simply no hope for survival. We were making arrangements for a casket to be delivered to the morgue or funeral home. I'll be damned if he didn't prove us wrong. I knew it was God's miracle, but I was reluctant to say so. The doctor said, "This is enough for me to start believing in God." "I know God spared him," I asserted. "I just didn't think doctors would give him the credit." "There are some things we just cannot do. Saving your father was one of those things. In Reykjavik, the staff is all hailing it as a miracle. They plan to write about him in their medical journals. I think your dad made converts of more than one person that day," he said. "I think I am one of them," I admitted. My perspective on life changed immeasurably at that point. I got down on my knees and gave thanks and praise to a God who would overlook all my many shortcomings and show me his miraculous ways. I was convicted of all my scoffing and pagan ways. My heart belonged to Jesus, and I would never be the same person again. The day I saw my father being wheeled off the plane in San Francisco was one of the happiest days of my life. I knew how Mary and Miriam must have felt the day Lazarus stepped out of his tomb. God had, in his mercy and love, delivered our father back to us. He was alert and awake as I approached him. I threw my arms around his neck and hugged him tight. I told him that I believe God had answered our prayers. The joy on Dad's face was the best gift I could have received. He had been praying for my salvation faithfully. He believed God had used him to bring me around. When we got Dad home and settled, we had long talks about his life and renewed our relationship with him on a new level. I could finally understand him as a man, having had days to ponder his humanity. I could not help but compare his life to Jesus, having been tried, tested, and proved to be a good and faithful servant. We spoke of faith and answered prayers. We were blessed with a second chance to get to know our Father and have the relationship we had always desired but never got around to achieving. I could not help but compare that with my own second chance with God. He had been dead to me, but now he was fully alive and the center of my world. We had time to develop a meaningful relationship, like the one I was rebuilding with my dad. I came to realize the folly of my ways and became determined to live a life pleasing to my Savior. As I talked with my dad and learned how hurt and sad he had been when I left the church, I realized I had done the same to Jesus and our Father in heaven. I learned that while I had always been close to my earthly dad, I had never bothered to really get to know him. I took him for granted and assumed he would always be there for me. I never saw things from his perspective, only my own self-centered one. I had been given a chance to change all that, and I was not going to let it pass me by. My sister had a similar epiphany, and she and Dad mended some broken fences from years gone by. All of us seemed to appreciate each day of life as a new and precious gift. There was renewed joy in our hearts that was obvious to everyone around us. I decided to try giving church another chance, too. I felt it was the least I could do, having received so rich a blessing. Instead of sitting hidden in the back row, I moved closer to the front, as if God would sense my presence even more. It was foolish, but I did not care. I hoped I was making God happy, and I knew I was making my dad happy, too. Shortly after my dad returned and had regained much of his strength, he insisted on going to church. He wanted to thank the Lord directly for giving us this renewed joy of living. We pulled into a parking space close to the door so Dad would not have to exert himself too much. Getting out of the car was a slow process, as his body was not fully recovered. I helped him stand up and steadied him while he got his balance. A shiny new Mercedes pulled into the next space. Once we had given them enough room, the door opened up, and it was Dad's oncologist. "Dr. Gordon," Dad said in a friendly tone. "Good to see you here." The doctor had never attended services before, so the words had more impact. "Jean, good to see you up and about," the doctor said, extending his hand. "Actually, you're the reason I'm here." "How's that?" my dad asked him. "It can be very easy for men like me to take credit for the health of our patients. We do try to heal people, but so often there seems to be an outside influence working on their recovery, especially in oncology. We see terminal patients turn around and pat ourselves on the back for saving them, kind of like your case." He paused for a moment, recalling Dad's amazing turnaround with a colostomy. He had no explanation for that, though he'd been happy to take credit. "Most of the time, we can point to a drug or treatment that explains a drastic turn. But then, there are other times." He kept talking as we moved towards the door. "There was a whole team working with your doctors in Iceland. 10 minds trying to find a way to reverse all the damage to your heart, your brain, and your vital organs that kept failing. Every single one of us concluded the same thing. You, my friend, were gone. Clinically, you should be dead. If there ever was a truly miraculous recovery, this was it. Some of the others went to church, convinced they had been witness to a miracle. It made me think. I guess I'm here checking things out. But it's because of you. My father blushed. He did not want the credit that he knew belonged to God. Feebly, he said, "Glad to be a vessel for your salvation." He wanted to sound light-hearted, but the words carried a sting of truth. "Maybe you are," the doc said, walking on to take a seat. "Maybe you are." After church, I sat down to write a long overdue thank you to the staff in Reykjavik for the level of care they provided my father. The doctors here were very impressed by the techniques and treatments they use that were not common in the U.S. Seeing the oncologist at church had reminded me to do it. Within about 2 weeks, life was more or less back to normal. Dad was able to get around on his own and was even released to drive short distances. That was enough to get him to and from church, and that was good enough for him. I was learning to trust Jesus and establish a relationship with him. I was so happy to be back in his presence. I was more alive than ever, and my family had never been closer. I thank God for saving me, and I thought how blessed I was that this has happened to me. It was even more extraordinary that Dr. Gordon had also found the Lord. I remember thinking just how huge this whole thing was. It was enough that my father lived. On top of that, we had found a closer, more loving relationship with one another. The fact that I had returned to the fold was the absolute icing on the cake. To learn an outsider had also been touched with God's grace was like sprinkles and cherries on top of the icing. If anyone would have told me how happy I would be after accepting Jesus, I would have laughed in their face until I experienced it for myself. It was nearly intoxicating. I walked around with a smile in my heart and a lilt in my step. I knew this must be what they called born again, because I felt like a different person. I was excited to see an envelope with a Reykjavik address in the post. One of the nurses, whom had worked extensively with my father, had a good command of the English language and had kindly responded to my note. "We were very happy to receive your note of thanks. I can assure you that your dad was an inspiration to all of us in Reykjavik. His amazing recovery had a profound effect on many of us. We know your family prayed for him constantly. Some of us believe your prayers were answered before our eyes. We are forever grateful." It took a moment for the note to sink in, but when it did, I was aware that God had used this entire crisis for His glory. How many souls had renewed their faith that day? I only know that I was but one of them, and I thank God every day for the miracle in Reykjavik.